stuff. Okay, so I'll leave that for future discussion on the discussion board, perhaps, if you're interested. For now, what we need to do is turn to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. So far we've only been talking, believe it or not, about one of these versions of the categorical imperative that Kant gives. He actually gives 4 of them. But before you freak out, we're only going to talk about these 2. Now, the first one he called the formulation of the laws of nature. And you could see that why he would call it that, because that formulation has us thinking about moral rules in respect of there being universal moral laws. Now, this is a different way of thinking about the categorical imperative. But according to Kant, it's a different way of thinking about the same thing. So this is not really a second rule of morality. It's the same rule. It's just looked at from a different perspective. And that, of course, has always puzzled people. But that's what he says. Okay, so we looked at the formula of laws of nature. Now we're going to turn to the second one, which is the formula of the ends in itself. Here's what it says. So act as to treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, as an end in itself, and never as a means only. Well, what is this supposed to mean? Well, what it means is, first of all, it gives us the same result in every case. But second of all, and more importantly, what this thing is trying to get at is that human beings have a value which can't be reduced to what they're good for. So in the world around us, there are things which, well, first of all, let me back up. As I said previously, rational agents set goals for themselves that they deem as good. So, for instance, you are working towards a college degree. You think it's a good thing to have a college degree, no doubt. Otherwise, you wouldn't be working towards it. So you have this thing that you recognize as a good, and you're working towards it. Now, there are things that you need to do in order to accomplish those goals, right? Those things that you need to do entail using the world around you in various ways. So if I need to go to work, I use my car as a means to get there. It's merely a tool to be manipulated by my rational nature. I see it as something which merely exists to serve my purposes. It's an object to be manipulated as I pursue the things that I deem good. Now, this second version of the categorical imperative is supposed to get at this basic idea. It is wrong to think of human beings in the same way that I think about my car. It is wrong to think of a rational agent as a tool that can be manipulated as a way to simply accomplish the goals that I set for myself. Now, why is this the case? Well, here's the basic argument that Kant gives. So take that story that I was just telling about how rational agents set goals for themselves, and they see these goals as goods. Now, this all has to do with this hypothetical imperative stuff that we talked about earlier. So you set yourself something as an end. You want to graduate from college, and then you have a bunch of hypothetical imperatives which then start mattering to you. If you want to graduate from college, then you need to take certain courses. If you want to graduate from college, then you need to pass those courses. If you want to graduate from college, then you need to attend those courses, etc., etc., etc. So now you have a reason to attend classes, to read books, to study, to show up on time, all because you're aiming towards this goal which you recognize as good. But of course, you're surrounded by other agents whom you recognize as rational. And you just got through telling a story about how rational agents set goals for themselves that they recognize as good. So from the point of the universe, if one were to reason impartially about this, you have to recognize that the other person's goals are just important to them are just as important to them as your goals are to you. And so just as you recognize that it's good for you to pursue these goals, you have to also recognize that it's good for them to pursue their goals. So you can't co-opt them in the service of pursuing your goals because they're pursuing their own goals. Now, interestingly, Kant thinks, well, for instance, in the case of animals, this isn't true. So it's always wrong to enslave a rational creature. A man should never be a slave. A woman either, for that matter. But a donkey is fine. If you take a donkey and harness it up to a cart and have that donkey pull the cart all day, you are not disrupting the goals of the donkey in any serious way. Now, what would the donkey be doing otherwise? Running around in a field somewhere, chewing on some grass perhaps, but it's not as though the donkey is sitting there thinking to itself, if only I weren't pulling this cart, I would be able to finish my degree at LaGuardia College. If only I weren't pulling this cart, I could get a job and make some real money. If only I weren't pulling this cart, I could blah, 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 blah. But of course, with a human being, with rationality comes the ability to plan, to set goals for oneself, to see them as good, and to pursue them. Whereas donkeys can't do that. So it's immoral to treat a human being as a means to your end. But Kant thinks perfectly moral to treat a donkey as a means to your end, or to treat a car as a means to your end. The car has no plans, no goals, sees nothing as good. Neither does the donkey, since all of that requires rational activity, recognizing the commonalities amongst things and that they belong to a class of that which is good. Okay, so that's the basic argument for why you can't treat other people as a means, because you don't, to put it bluntly, you don't want yourself to be treated as a means. In fact, the very concept of yourself as a rational agent entails that you can't be treated as a means. You demand that other people respect you as an end, as something which is valuable in its own right. And so since you demand that respect, and you recognize that the reason that you're owed that respect is in virtue of your rational nature and your ability to set goals for yourself, then you must respect that and recognize it in other creatures that you see around you that exhibit those properties. So you are forbidden to treat them as a way to simply accomplish your goals, just like they are forbidden to treat you that way. And it's because of your rational nature. So rationality is at once the foundation for morality and the very thing which gives us value. It's what makes us moral agents in the first place. And as we'll see later, this is something the utilitarians object to, because it basically means that insofar as a thing isn't rational, that is insofar as it doesn't matter morally. And that's certainly what Kant thinks. If you are not rational, then you simply don't matter morally. There's nothing that you can do to a car which is immoral. Now, of course, you could be immoral to the owner of the car, but not to the car itself. And insofar as donkeys are like cars, you can't be immoral to them either, Kant thinks. We'll come back to that. Okay, so let's look at the 4 examples that we talked about, the perfect and imperfect duties, and notice also that there are some duties to oneself and duties to others here. So what's wrong with the lying promise? Well, here Kant says you're treating the other person as a means only, not as an end. You recognize that they won't give you the money unless you fulfill a certain requirement. So you just reason, how can I get this person to do what I want them to do? You, in effect, treat them as though they were an ATM. What's the code I need to punch in order to get the action that I want out? Money. Well, punch in code I promise to pay back, even though you don't intend to. Clearly, you're not respecting this person's goals and what they're trying to accomplish. You're trying to manipulate them to reduce them to something which is no better than a donkey or an ATM. Now, the same, of course, is true of stealing. You recognize that the person doesn't want to give you this thing, wouldn't give it up voluntarily, otherwise you would ask for them. So you think of a way to circumvent their their goals, their desires. And the way you do that is by simply taking it, using them as a means to accomplish your goals, reducing them simply to a storehouse of goods for you. So now suicide, Kant says, well, you're using yourself as a means to pleasure. And that's always been a bit controversial, but you can see what he means if you think about it. You're in this terrible agony, and the way you want to get out of this agony is by killing yourself, and relief from agony is a kind of pleasure. So you're not respecting yourself as something valuable, but you're simply thinking of your life and its end as a way to achieve a kind of pleasure, namely absence of suffering. Now, Now, at the end here, so that sums up basically the Kantian view in its very broad outline. Now, of course, there are all these kinds of traditional problems. And I just want to, at the end here, before we start talking about utilitarianism, point out some of the more traditional problems. In fact, this leads us right into our discussion of utilitarianism. So I mentioned this already, but anything that's not rational has no moral value and be treated as a means only. So this is always the first thing that people think of here usually is animals. What about animals? Well, Kant says that's right. We owe them nothing. They are not moral agents. They don't matter. Even though they feel pain, there's no way that you can act immorally to a dog, Kant thinks, because dogs aren't rational. They don't have rights, Kant says, because to have a right is to be a member of the moral community. To be a member of the moral community is to be a rational agent. So animals don't have rights. Neither do cars, neither do houses or trees. Trees are alive, they don't have rights. Animals are alive, they don't have rights. Animals feel pain, but that doesn't matter morally, Kant thinks. What matters is rationality. So now you'd say, well, gee, that's weird. So if I kick a dog and cause it pain, I'm not doing anything wrong to the dog? Kant says, no, you're not morally harming the dog, but you might be morally harming the person whose dog it is. So if I love that dog, and when you kick it and it cries, that causes distress in me, then you've harmed me. And that's bad, because you ought not to harm me. You have a duty not to cause unnecessary suffering in me. But of course, you don't have any duties to the dog. You're not violating your duty to cause unnecessary suffering when you kick the dog, Kant thinks. And people have always found that to be very counterintuitive. It seems very strange, to say the least. But even worse, you might think, is, well, gee, what about babies? And the elderly, the senile, the mentally incompetent, the schizophrenic, etc. They're not rational, so what do you say then? Well, it seems like you have to say the very same thing that you say about animals. And that's always bothered people. Well, you mean it's not morally wrong to kick a baby? You don't have a duty not to harm the baby? Well, you might have a duty not to cause harm to the parents, but you don't have any duties to the baby, people say. Now, there are various moves that people make here. For instance, they argue, some people have said, well, since babies will be rational someday, you should treat them as though they are now. So you're sort of like a check, on condition that later you be rational, I treat you a certain way. But of course, what if they grow up to be mentally incompetent or to have brain damage? Then you don't owe them anything. Again, it just seems wrong in its general structure, not in the details of it. It just seems wrong to think that rationality is all that matters. It seems to a lot of people that pain matters, and that if you cause pain in something, it doesn't matter whether that thing thinks or not. If it can feel pain, then it's bad to cause pain, because pain is itself bad. And Kant just doesn't think that. But that's what the utilitarians think, and that's who we're going to turn to next.